So we have the live stream going. All right, you all set?
Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us as we continue our Week 9 Lifelong Scholars Week of celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. My name is Dakota Harkins, and I'm the Director of Education and Heritage Programming here at Lakeside Chautauqua. And as I said, this week we're taking a look at the years leading up to and following August of 1920, which is when the adoption of the 19th Amendment was certified. If you missed it yesterday and on Monday, Dr. Catherine Jellison joined us for 4 programs about the very start of the suffrage movement and into the second women's movement in the later 20th century. And you can find those on the Lakeside Chautauqua website at the calendar, and then also on the Lakeside Facebook page. Today's morning program is going to be focused on suffrage along the color lines, and I'm thrilled to be welcoming Dr. Carol Lasser, who will be joining us for today's program just this morning. Dr. Lasser is a Merit Professor of History at Oberlin College, when she's the former chair of the History Department in the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies program there. And at Oberlin, she focused on women, gender, and race in American history. And she earned her bachelor's degree at the University of Pennsylvania and her PhD at Harvard University. And we are thrilled to have her with us today. So welcome, Dr. Lasser. We're so glad to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here in this very historic week. Yesterday, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the vote in Tennessee. And next week, we will commemorate the 100th anniversary of the enrollment of the 19th Amendment, making it the law of the land. And it's really a great time to kind of look backward and think about what does this all mean. So for a moment, what I would like you to do is a thought experiment. What would happen if women didn't have the vote today? Just for a moment, what would it be like if women could not vote? Well, today we think of this as utterly obvious, but what I want you to do is to remember that there is a time in which this was a very disputed notion, the idea that women could vote. And so women fought very hard for the vote, the expansion of the democracy without respect to gender. But I'm going to make an argument today that this is a centennial that we should commemorate and use to think about women winning the vote, but it's not one that we should wholeheartedly celebrate. That is, look, it's a very simple, straightforward piece of prose, right? The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by any of the United States or by any state on account of sex. Prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. But really, did it enfranchise all women voters? What about Asian American women who didn't get the vote really until 1943? Or Native American women who were kept out of the vote in some states as late as 1962? And in particular, what about African American women? African American women were unable to exercise the franchise in many, if not most cases, until 1965 with the enactment of the Voting Rights Law. What I want to suggest today is that these omissions, the absence of voting rights for these women voters, was not accidental. Rather, it was part of a strategy that white suffragists used, white Northern suffragists used, in order to woo and win support from Southern states. That is, white suffragists intentionally recognized and went along with the color line, as it was called in the early 20th century. So I want us, as we commemorate this 100th anniversary, to recognize the complicity of white suffrage leaders in the casual but brutal segregation in day-to-day life in the early 20th century. I don't think it's ever been more important to recognize the ways in which this underlies some of the distrust among women today, with Black Lives Matter, with the rise of racial consciousness. I think it's very, very important to recognize what happened 100 years ago in the fight for the woman's vote. Now, to be sure, I want to recognize that there are strong women of color who participated in the suffrage battle, who, as they say, persisted. But this is, above all, a story about complexity and complexity in the world of race, about alliances and ambiguities, about change over time, as well as continuity. And it demands that we think not only about our legacy, but also about what we will do with that legacy in 2020, one of the most important electoral years, I think, in my lifetime. So, how am I going to do this? I'm going to tell you the story with particular focus on the struggle for the vote in the state of Ohio. I'm going to break this into 4 time periods. The first stage, the Abolitionist Feminist Alliance. The second stage, we're going to look at a period of time after the Civil War in which the women's suffrage movement broke into 2 particular branches, 2 particular wings, each of them with problematic rhetoric around race. We're going to then turn to when these 2 wings came back together and see how race continued to play a part in the movement that they built together. And finally, we're going to turn to Ohio to see where it was in this final push. Okay, spoiler alert, spoiler alert. The conclusion here, as my title implies, is that I'm going to suggest that Ohio's women's suffrage movement bent the color line, allowing for activism by both African-American women and white women in the final stages of the suffrage movement, but that it did not, in the end, directly confront the underlying problems of racial inequality that were, in a sense, built deep into this movement. All right, so that's what we're going to do. So, to begin, let's look at the Abolitionist Feminist Alliance. For some, the abolitionist movement was, as they said, a school for women's rights. Among those who were active in the abolitionist movement and through that came to an understanding of the need to fight for women's rights was Lucy Stone on the left there, a graduate of my institution, Oberlin College, in 1847. Lucy actually came to Oberlin as an abolitionist, wanted to practice her speaking skills. When she graduated in 1847, she left to participate in the American Anti-Slavery Society as a lecturer. And what she found was when she went out to speak about the emancipation of people of color, that she was challenged about her right to speak, was a woman to really occupy the platform. Well, Lucy said, I was a woman before I was an abolitionist, and she decided she would speak for women's rights on the weekends and for emancipation during the week. So this notion here of rights for all, of an alliance between African Americans and white women, well, women, in order to fight for rights for all. On the right there, lesser known, is Betsy Mix Coles, also a graduate of Oberlin College. Betsy Mix Coles was also brought up in an abolitionist household, and she became the president of the Salem Female Women's Rights Convention in 1850. This was the first convention at which, the first women's rights convention in the state of Ohio. It was an exciting convention. It brought together abolitionists, Quakers, universal peace advocates, radical thinkers of all kinds. Betsy Mix Coles presided, and it was a very forward-looking convention, again, full of people looking for universal emancipation. It passed a resolution at the end saying that it demanded not only the for women, not only, and I quote here, the right to suffrage, but all the political and legal rights that are guaranteed to men. So complete equality. Very, very close alliance, the Abolitionist Feminist Alliance. It also was responsible for bringing to the state of Ohio in 1851 at the Akron Women's Rights Convention. The person pictured here, Sojourner Truth, a self-emancipated slave. The Akron Convention is probably best known for Sojourner Truth's famous speech, "Aren't I a Woman?" It was a speech in which she linked anti-slavery and women's rights and Black equality. Hauntingly, right, Truth claimed both her race and her gender and insisted on the strength and respectability of both. So a very strong abolitionist feminist alliance in the earliest years. Now, during the Civil War, abolitionist feminists supported the war as they saw it for Black emancipation. They suspended the national conventions that the women's rights movement had been having quite regularly since 1850. And they threw themselves into efforts to roll bandages, to nurse casualties, to sponsor what were called sanitary fairs, which were held to support the families of soldiers, all in the name of freeing the slaves. But tragically, in the war's aftermath, Ohio fell in line with a women's suffrage movement that was increasingly deserting its commitment to racial equality. Now, I think it's important to realize what an enormous transformation went on in the US Constitution in the years between 1865 and 1870. Talk about tumultuous times, talk about complete and utter changes. The three Reconstruction Amendments transformed the place of African Americans within the United States and within the Constitution. So the first of these, enormously transformative, was of course the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. It was proposed and ratified in 1865. Abolitionist women, feminist women, everybody was thrilled. 14th Amendment became a little bit more problematic. The 14th Amendment's been in the news a lot lately. It does, in fact, assure citizenship to all persons born and naturalized in the United States. This solved what had been a question about whether slaves were citizens of the United States. So all persons born and naturalized in the United States. And it implied the enfranchisement of people of color, men of color, by having as one of its clauses a provision that would disenfranchise, that states that disenfranchised any male voters would have their representation in Congress adjusted accordingly. It was the first time in the US Constitution that the word male applied. So that was proposed in 1866 and ratified in 1868, and it was ratified in 1870 with a 15th Amendment, a transformational amendment that clarified that there would be no restrictions of the vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And that was supposed to assure the vote to Black men in particular. Transformative. And by the way, while we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, we should be really looking at the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment. Well, what I can tell you is that abolitionist feminists were furious. They were furious at the 14th Amendment for writing the word male in, and they were furious that the 15th Amendment was silent on the issue of gender. Susan B. Anthony was among those who was infuriated by the idea that Black men won the vote, but not women of all races. She had believed that the war for emancipation of Black men would also be a war that would carry forward women. As she put it, she believed that by becoming soldiers, Black men had earned the right to vote, and that, as she put it, and this is a quote, women would pass through the constitutional door to enfranchisement on the strong arm and blue uniform of the Black soldier. She had hoped that the Abolitionist Feminist Alliance would carry forward. But when the 14th and then the 15th Amendment came through, they felt betrayed. And Anthony herself declared, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work or demand the ballot for the Negro and not for the woman." Now, male abolitionists tried to talk her down. There was a famous exchange in which she was told, "This is the Negro's hour." This was male abolitionists who believed, and I think with great, with some cause, that Black men needed the vote immediately because of the threats of violence against them and a feeling that they might lose all of the gains that had been made in this very, very bloody war. And they assured Susan B. Anthony, "Your turn will come next." But Anthony was not to be put off. With Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the two founded the National Woman Suffrage Association, and they refused to work for Black suffrage or Black equality. So it's one thing to remain silent on the question of Black equality, but it's another thing to actively undermine it. And unfortunately, I have to tell you that Stanton and Anthony began to do this. They did this with the help of the man pictured here, George Francis Train, an entrepreneur and political gadfly who was called by William Lloyd Garrison, one of the prime abolitionist spokespeople. Garrison called Train a crack-brained semi-lunatic. So a lot of animosity here. Train was, and I'm going to use the R word, a racist. He helped Stanton and Anthony, sponsoring their speeches, funding their travels, and funding this newspaper, The Revolution. I hope you can see in the middle there, part of the very long masthead says, "Men their rights and nothing more, women their rights and nothing less," which sounds good. But Train was known for using this paper for a number of rants against Black male voters, sometimes even using the N-word. And he began to draw Stanton and Anthony into this maelstrom. Stanton, in particular, was intemperate in her use of words. Stanton became infamous for one particularly offensive tirade in which she said, "Think of Patrick," and here she's using the slang for the Irish immigrant. "Think of Patrick and Sambo," again, a derogatory slang for African Americans, and Sambo and Hans, again, derogatory slang for German immigrants, and Jung Chung, obviously derogatory for Chinese. So she says, "Think of Patrick and Sambo and Hans and Jung Chung, who do not know the difference between a monarchy and a republic, who never read the Declaration of Independence, making laws for Lucretia Mott." And I think you probably are familiar with Mott as being really one of the icons of the women's suffrage movement, above reproach, really a lovely and strong advocate for both abolition and feminism. So Stanton and Anthony insisted that what they were looking for was what they called impartial suffrage, votes for all educated people, and the equal disenfranchisement of all illiterates, both foreign-born and newly emancipated, whatever their gender. But this meant taking the vote now away from most of the newly freed men of color and withholding it from freed women. So in anger over what they felt was their betrayal by abolitionist allies, Stanton and Anthony deserted the cause of racial equality. Not everybody followed them. This person, who we've met before now, Lucy Stone, founded the American Women's Suffrage Association and worked for the 15th Amendment. She recognized, again, the special claim of Black men for the need for the vote. As she put it, I would be grateful if anyone could get out of this pit. She recognized the need for enfranchisement of African Americans. But before we applaud her too much, let me just introduce you to her husband, Henry Brown Blackwell, who was peddling another version of a white supremacist strategy. Blackwell in 1868, trying to appeal to Southern leaders who were rejoining the Union, tried to offer a demographic argument for white supremacy and the enfranchisement of women. As he put it, your 4 millions of Southern white women will counterbalance your 4 millions of Negro men and women, and thus the political supremacy of your white race will remain unchanged. So this is Henry Blackwell in 1868. At that time, few of the leaders below the Mason-Dixon line saw it in quite the same way, but over the years, they discovered other ways in which to disenfranchise Black men in particular. After Reconstruction, they maintained white male control through a combination of outright violence, and I think that's been kind of underplayed in some of our understandings of Reconstruction, as well as the maneuvers of poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and the bias manipulation of registration procedures. So all of these undercut the ability of Black men to exercise their rights under the 15th Amendment. And what we find is that at the beginning of the 20th century, when more than 90% of all African Americans lived beneath the Mason-Dixon line, less than 5% of adult African American men living in the states of the former Confederacy could exercise the right to vote. 5% of the adult African American men living in the states of the former Confederacy could exercise their right to vote. Now, for more than 2 decades then, the two rival suffrage organizations kind of bumped along, neither making much progress. The National tried to get some attention on Capitol Hill. There were, from time to time, hearings about a federal suffrage amendment. It never went very far. The American tried to do some state level work, again, bumping along, not very much going on, except in a few Western territories. And by 1890, we see the vote for women in Wyoming, Utah, the Washington Territory, and Montana. So a few of these Western territories bumping along. There emerged, though, by 1890, new generation of suffrage leaders and a sense that the two organizations should be brought together. And they came together in 1890 as the cleverly named National American Women's Suffrage Association. Both of them brought with them a racial strategy. Both wings brought with them a racial strategy. And they united in the National American. So in 1893, shortly after the two wings had been united, they held a convention at which they explained their position that educated white women deserve the vote more than many categories of men. And here is the 1893 quote: "We call attention," this was a resolution, "we call attention to the significant facts that in every state there are more women who can read and write than the whole number of illiterate voters, more white women who can read and write than all Negro voters, more American women who can read and write than all foreign voters, so that the enfranchisement of such women would settle the vexed question of rule by illiteracy, whether of homegrown or foreign-born production." And I have to tell you that this resolution passed without dissent at the 1893 convention. This was not a broadly based women's rights movement looking for diversity and inclusion. 2 years later, in 1895, the Venerable Susan B. Anthony, who was then the president of this merged organization, reached out to one of her old friends, Frederick Douglass, a self-emancipated slave, a man who had been present in 1848 at Seneca Falls, and she asked him not to attend the upcoming convention of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which would be held in Atlanta, Georgia. It was the first time that the National American Woman Suffrage Association would hold a national convention in a southern and segregated state. This was not an isolated incident. In 1903, the NAWSA, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, held its annual convention in New Orleans, and it simply prohibited Black delegates, which is why they were not there to hear this person, Belle Kearney, proclaim the enfranchisement of women would ensure immediate and durable white supremacy. Belle Kearney was perhaps the best known woman in Mississippi. She would later publish an autobiography called A Slave Owner's Daughter. So problematic racial politics within this merged organization. And this was true not only for the national, but it was true for the so-called radical wing of the party, of the woman suffrage movement as well, right? The National Women's Party, the so-called militants who emerged in the second decade of the 20th century, had a similar position of not disturbing the color line in the South. These are the radicals. These are the women who, you see them here, picketing the White House. And these were the women who were, they were heroines. They went to jail for picketing. They were force-fed. Many of them put their health at risk. Some of them really were in impaired health for the rest of their lives. These are very, very brave women, but they were not brave. They were not brave on questions of race. Their debate handbook had a kind of question and answer format. And one of the questions was, will a federal suffrage amendment complicate the race problem in the South? So these militants were instructed to answer, a federal suffrage amendment merely forbids disenfranchisement of a woman on the sole grounds that she is a woman, completely avoiding questions of racial inequality. Okay, so at this point, most of the major suffrage organizations support a Southern strategy, pledging not to disturb the so-called legal methods of disenfranchisement, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and literacy tests. And most of them are also silent on the rising problem of lynching, something that mobilized Black women, begged them to speak out on. All right. What does this mean then for the women of Ohio? Okay, what are our predecessors thinking of at this point? Well, to begin, let's back up for just a minute. While we're proud of our abolitionist feminist past, not every early Ohioan was an abolitionist feminist. In fact, in Ohio, in 1803, when statehood was achieved, the state provided that African Americans, free African Americans in the state of Ohio, had to post a bond of $500 in order to remain in the state of Ohio. While this was rarely enforced, it remained on the books for many years. And despite the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Ohio state constitution maintained an article that limited voting to white males. And it retained this into the 20th century, white males, although of course, men of color voted and some even held office in some parts of the state. As for women, some progress had been made. In 1894, Ohio passed a school suffrage law. They gave the vote to women in school elections. Notion here being that it was a good thing for women who were in charge of children, right, to be able to vote for members of the school boards who would educate their children. Women used this as an entryway to begin to talk more broadly about their need for the vote. And they did it with a notion of all of these things that were traditionally a part of women's responsibilities, responsibilities for children, responsibilities for the purity of the home, for the food served in the home, for the water served in the home, for the clothing increasingly being manufactured from outside the house. All of these things, women needed the vote in order to be able to vote for men who would protect the purity of the items coming into the home. This kind of civic housekeeping was a profoundly important argument. And it was an argument made by Black women as well as white women. So although they mostly made it, Black women and white women mostly made it in separate organizations. In my hometown, Oberlin, Ohio, Black women organized out of the local Black Baptist church, something called the Women's Progressive Organization, a very important part of civic life in my town. They were pro-suffrage, but suffrage, white women were part of an equal suffrage league, separately organized. There were similar parallel organizations and suffrage clubs in Toledo and in Dayton. Now, Cleveland, done a little bit of work on Cleveland, and particularly the woman on the right side here, who is Lethea Cousins Fleming, a Republican Party operative, a very early woman of color to be involved in the Republican Party. She was involved with suffrage, both in a local Black club and in the downtown suffrage meetings that brought together Black and white women. One of her allies is the woman on the left, who is Jane Edna Hunter. Jane Edna Hunter, herself a migrant from the South, established the Phyllis Wheatley Association in Cleveland that was for Southern migrant women coming from the South and needing a place to stay as they looked for work in the new industrial North. These two women, Fleming and Hunter, worked as well in a Black organization with Mary Martin, another woman of color who had become the first Black woman to serve on the Cleveland School Board. But they also came down to downtown to work with the woman in the middle, who is Elizabeth Hauser. Elizabeth Hauser was a major aide to Mayor Tom Johnson, one of the great progressive mayors of Cleveland. So in Cleveland, the color line appears to have been a little bit more flexible. We know this in some ways because of accounts as well from the suffrage parades in downtown Cleveland. Now, you probably during this week of commemoration of the 19th Amendment have become aware that in 1913, there was a major suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. On the eve of the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. And at that parade, Black suffrage leaders, most particularly Ida B. Wells Barnett, were told to march at the end of the suffrage parade. These were women of color who were told march at the end. Barnett actually dared to integrate the parade, but the official line was Black and white separate. Cleveland didn't have that line, not in 1912, which this float picture is from, or in 1914, where Black and white women marched together. And in Columbus, it also seems to have been a mixed parade. Indeed, Black suffragists mounted their own floats, and I wish I had pictures of these Black women's floats. One had a tableau of Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation, and the other had a banner reading, not exactly historically accurate. It said, "The white man freed us in 1861. We intend to free women in 1912. Again, I wish I had photographs of these, but they do indicate some greater flexibility, some bending of the color line in the state of Ohio. And it's perhaps because of this that Ohio was so important in nurturing some of the women of color who led in the suffrage movement. Among them, Mary Church Terrell in the middle there. Mary Church Terrell had grown up in Memphis, attended Oberlin College, and at Oberlin became converted to the suffrage cause. Terrell went on to work for suffrage within the Black Women's Club movement, and she was actually one of the very few women of color to join the militant wing and picket the White House. On the left, Mary Burnett Talbert, born in Oberlin, educated at Oberlin College. When she married and moved to Buffalo, she became one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Mary Burnett Talbert was important in lobbying to support women's suffrage within that organization. And there she had the support of W.E.B. Du Bois, who said, quite memorably and quite right on, he said, "Every argument for women's suffrage is an argument for Negro suffrage. Both are great movements in democracy." And then on the right, Hallie Q. Brown. She was a dynamic educator, author, and activist. Hallie Q. Brown was a major force in the state's Black Women's Club movement. Again, she mobilized this club movement in support of women's suffrage, became important at a national level. Now, but even these prominent women of color could not convince the national suffrage movement to abandon its Southern strategy. Instead, when we think about it, what we find there is what we can at best call insensitivity, and at worst, a full-fledged espousal of the doctrines of separate and unequal, both nationally and in Ohio. Let me give you two Ohio examples. Here's the first. In 1911, the Cleveland Women's Suffrage Party, then the largest women's suffrage organization in the state of Ohio, decided it would celebrate the opening of its new downtown headquarters with a trip for its members to Cedar Point. But the women of color who might have wanted to join them there could not have taken advantage of the segregated dance hall or been among these women enjoying the segregated white-only beach. More straightforward was probably the decision to invite Miss Laura Clay by the Cincinnati suffragists to lecture on women's suffrage in the state of Ohio during the 1912 campaign. Clay brought with her both her support for women's votes, but also her support for a Southern strategy that would uphold white supremacy. Now, Clay is an example of a woman who left the National American Woman Suffrage Association for the Southern Woman Suffrage Association when she feared that a national level amendment might in fact undercut white supremacy and bring attention to the lack of enforcement of the 15th Amendment in the Southern states. So she joined a Southern Woman Suffrage Association that was for women's suffrage on a statewide basis. But even that, she left eventually thinking that might itself undercut white supremacy in the Southern states. So perhaps because of Clay, or maybe despite Clay, the 1912 suffrage amendment went down. This was an amendment, a popular referendum to add an amendment to the Constitution in 1912. A similar provision went down by popular vote in 1914. And this ticket is actually from the 1914 election. You can see it invoking the history of Lincoln in a very Republican state here. And then it, in 1917, a popular vote shot down a referendum for presidential suffrage, a measure that, by the way, had been passed by the Ohio State Legislature. In the end, we have to say women's suffrage came to Ohio only with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Full women's suffrage came only with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And so you may be asking, why? This is a moment in time, 1912, 1914, 1917, that woman suffragists literally sweeping the country. Suffragists expected it to come from the West, which had been the place where the earliest women's suffrage victories had happened, propelled by recent votes in California, to sweep across the country and to bring women's suffrage to all of these struggling citizens. And soon, even Illinois and then New York would pass women's suffrage amendments. Why was Ohio so impossible to get to vote for women's suffrage? Well, and I hope this is of particular interest to you at Lakeside. It was, according to the state librarian and historian Charles Burley Galbraith, very bluntly, he said, the liquor interests kept Ohio women from being granted suffrage. And liquor was in those days a very complicated cultural and racial issue. So, as you know, I'm sure, Ohio was the birthplace of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. It was here that under Frances Willard, organization began to take place to provide, as they put it, the ballot for home protection, an expansion of that domestic need for the ballot for women, a notion here that American women needed to be able to vote in order to vote down alcohol, protect their homes, protect their children, protect the civic infrastructure. WCTU chapters in Ohio brought this white ribbon campaign and votes for women to the state and really to the nation. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of women became suffragists under the auspices of the WCTU, including women of color who had their own special units within the WCTU. They, that is, women of color, embraced temperance and they embraced the votes for women under this, thinking that it was a way to counter some of the terrible rhetoric about how drink inflamed Black men. It was a way to claim respectability for themselves, for their men, for their households. So they were enthusiastic advocates, not all, but many of them were enthusiastic advocates of temperance and enthusiastic advocates of its call for votes for women. It was a form of empowerment. But not all suffragists wanted to be associated with the temperance movement. In fact, here are two women, Belle Sherwin and Florence Ellen Wood Allen, who saw themselves as part of a progressive movement, and they wanted to really distance themselves from the prohibitionists, partly because they wanted to distance women's rights, women's votes, from the notion of temperance. Belle Sherwin, a truly impressive woman. She was Cleveland born, was Wellesley educated, and she was a founder and a member of almost all of the progressive organizations in the city of Cleveland, the city's Consumer League, the Visiting Nurses, the Cleveland Women's City Club, the Cleveland Welfare League. She was president of the Woman Suffrage Party of Greater Cleveland, and she was later president of the National League of Women Voters. Truly an impressive and energetic woman. She wanted to remain silent. She didn't want to bring temperance into this. Same with Florence Ellen Wood Allen, who had deep Cleveland roots. She was internationally educated and earned a JDA lawyer's degree from NYU. She was committed to immigrant protection and fair employment practices for all. Florence Ellen Wood Allen here is shown in her judge's robe. She was the first woman elected to a judgeship in the state of Ohio, the first American woman to serve on a state Supreme Court, and the first woman appointed to a federal circuit judge. So these were progressive Cleveland, progressive Ohio women, and they did not want to make woman suffrage the tail on the prohibition kite. But the liquor interest had other plans. they indeed continued to tie women's suffrage and prohibition together, warning the voters of Ohio that if they voted for women's suffrage, women would make their homes dry, it would make their workplaces dry, it would take away their beer and their alcohol. And these liquor lobbyists had very, very deep pockets. Indeed, in the city of Cleveland alone, beer was a $5 million business in 1910, and that would be the equivalent of $135 million today. And the state of Ohio was the third largest beer brewing state in the country. So the liquor industry rallied against women's suffrage, and they rallied in the name of what they were very smart. They had a number of different organizations, among them the Personal Liberty League. This is an anti-prohibition cartoon. It has the Anti-Saloon League, which is the men's political arm of prohibition, bestowing the wreath of fanaticism on personal liberty that he has killed. This is an anti-prohibition cartoon. So they organized the Personal Liberty League, they organized the Home Rule League, and they also, especially in Ohio, poured money into the German-American Alliance. They were defending beer, they said, as a cultural practice. And at this moment in time, perhaps 1/3 of Ohio's population was of German descent. This is a big deal. So the 1912 defeat, fueled by liquor opposition, went down. 1912 was a defeat, 1914 was a defeat, 1917 was a defeat. Only with the coming of World War I were the liquor interests successfully challenged. And then I have to say, there's a mobilization of a xenophobia that I think is quite disturbing. Here's a cartoon to give you a sense, right? So with the coming of the war, Germany became the enemy, then German Americans became the enemy, then German beer became suspect. So a xenophobia coming out of World War I, okay? And beer, indeed, all alcohol, was truly demonized as it was associated with our wartime enemy. Okay, so these are prohibition cartoons. This and here, the literal demonization of the German with the pointed tail in the back and the beer barrel as a weapon to be used against America. So the Great War, World War I, really brought the ratification of the 18th Amendment, prohibition, banning the sale and manufacture of alcohol. And in the aftermath of the 18th Amendment, the liquor lobby largely gave up its campaign against women's suffrage. And so, when given the chance, without the interference of the liquor lobby, Ohio was among the first 5 states to ratify the 19th Amendment. Okay, so let's stand back for a moment and figure out where we all are. What can we conclude? Well, we know that our state nurtured some really important suffrage leaders, Black and white. And we know that in a few pockets of our state, Black and white women worked both separately and together in the struggle to achieve suffrage. But when confronted with the color line, Ohio's white suffrage leaders did not directly challenge it. Instead, they continued to support a women's suffrage movement that ignored the Southern disenfranchisement of African American men in order to achieve their goal. And you can see the anger and disappointment in this cartoon, which is, I believe, it's a 1913 cartoon. I believe it's from The Crisis, the NAACP's national publication. And it kind of gives you that sense of the alienation of women of color from the mainstream white suffrage movement. And I just want to note here that there was this problem about foreign-born as well. So in the state of Ohio, the Ohio Woman Suffrage Association did not accept as members foreign-born women until 1918. That is, the Ohio Woman Suffrage Association would not allow foreign-born women to become members until 1918, even if they were citizens. So even in Ohio, suffragists fell far short of where we would want them to have been. Now, as we look back on it, maybe you can begin to understand why I want to commemorate, but not celebrate the 19th Amendment. We need to, in 2020, on our 100th anniversary, recognize that it was not accidental that the suffrage movement failed to create racial equality or to celebrate diversity. It's not accidental. Rather, it was part of an intentional political strategy. And intolerance is not a heritage that we should be celebrating. We can and should do better. So just looking ahead a little bit, after the passage of the 19th Amendment, Ohio women of color challenged the successor to the National American, that is the League of Women Voters, to reach out to Black citizens in the North and the South and to make the amendment real for them. But the League of Women Voters was slow to act. It took decades to agree to study it, and then even more time to begin to act on Southern disenfranchisement. Not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 would federal powers finally move to enforce the 15th Amendment, making it possible for Black women and Black men to exercise their rights under the 15th and the 19th Amendments. Now, again, I'm not trying to recite this complicated and distressing history in order to diminish the importance of women's suffrage. Any expansion of democracy is absolutely important. And we need to make sure that we continue to push for equitable access to the polls for all people. And that struggle for voting equality brings us down really to our contemporary issues. We need to think about the many initiatives that may have an impact of suppressing voting even when not intended, and particularly have racially different impacts, outcomes, unnecessary ID requirements, capacious changes in polling places that are difficult to get to, gerrymandering that makes some votes more important than others, threats, as we're all following right now, threats to the Postal Service. All of these are ways in which we need to maintain and push forward towards an even more representative and encompassing electorate and a democratic process that respects diversity and inclusion. So what I want to close by asking is that we think about how our voting today is a result of what happened to our process all the way through. And I close by offering you this, the bumper sticker on my not very clean family car. Let us remember how important the vote is, and let us vote like our democracy depends on it. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to questions. I'm going to flash up here as well as we're talking. You can get a reading list for all ages put together by the Ohio League of Women Voters in conjunction with the Ohio Humanities Council at either of these URLs. You can continue to look at this fascinating, difficult, and at times heartbreaking history. Okay.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lasser. That was, I learned something every single time we have one of these programs. It is amazing, and it's inspiring to see all these women. And even though it's always been controversial, I think it's important to know that's part of the history too, that there's always been both sides of the argument here. I did have someone ask on Facebook about resources. So let me pull that one up and maybe we can, Betsy on Facebook asked, would you post some resources for us to learn about your subject? And thank you so much for the lecture. So what maybe we can do is now that you have this page up, what we'll get from Dr. Lasser, see if she can send this link along to us and we can repost it also on the Facebook so you can have the direct links if that works for you.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of exciting stuff coming out right now. And this, we updated our reading list in May, but stay tuned on this particular topic, the one I talked on today. There's a new book that's due out in September by Martha Jones called Vanguard. And it's about the struggle, Black women, specifically about Black women's struggle for the vote. Brand new. Martha Jones is an extraordinary historian. She had a piece in last weekend's New York Times special section. I really, it was not out in time to include in this reading list, but I recommend that as well.
Well, we'll have to put that, maybe we can reach out to her and have some contact for future seasons as well.
Yeah. Yes.
So we did, I apologize to anyone who was trying to enter into the Zoom at the start of the program. We realized that the passcode had expired to get into Zoom, which may have deterred some of our viewers as well. But one question I'd like to bring up, since it is very present in everything that's going on right now. Yesterday, President Trump pardoned Susan B. Anthony for 100 years ago, prior to 100 years ago. So with the whole pardoning situation, what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, so in 1872, Susan B. Anthony marched to the polls in Buffalo and demanded the right to vote. And I think they were a little flustered. They allowed her to vote. She was subsequently brought into a federal district court for violating the law. She was fined. And she was convicted and fined. She refused to pay her fine, and she refused to recognize the validity of her conviction. So I think she would have felt that she did not need to be pardoned for what she did. She thought what she was doing was right. Women had the right to vote. So she would not have asked Donald Trump to pardon her, but I am delighted that the president endorses voting by women.
Mm-hmm. And I can agree on that one. I've been curious when I saw that news. I was excited about you being willing to answer that today because I think it's something that makes this whole week very real for everyone.
Very
well, yes. We haven't had any other questions come in, but I'd like to remind everyone is obviously we do have Dr. Lasser's contact information. So if you are watching this at a later time, we would love to receive some of your questions and we can pass them along. Clearly, she has a lot of background, a lot of history, and I'm sure would be willing to answer whatever questions or point us in the right direction to learn more in the future.
Yes, of course. Pleasure to be with you virtually at Lakeside. I'm only sorry I can't be there to see the lake with you.
Mm-hmm. We would love to have you here on site again in the future. We're grateful that you made this transition to virtual for this season and thankful for your time and your energy in presenting today. But thank you everyone for your questions and for joining us this morning. And thank you again, Dr. Lasser. It's been great working with you. And we will see you all again tomorrow as we continue our 19th Amendment Celebration Week.
Thank you.